All right, hello. My name is Micah Qualle. I am happy and actually grateful to be able to step into this virtual space with everybody. I, like everyone else, have spent a lot of time on virtual contacts, and it is strange to be on this end of the camera. So if I seem distracted or wander off in my thoughts, hopefully you can have some grace with me in that. Like I said, my name is Micah Qualle. I am an elder here at University Presbyterian Church, but I'm not currently serving on session. That's not an invitation or an ask to be invited back on the session at this time, but yeah, I've been I'm a therapist in town as well, and have been adjusting to church, school, life, work, all of that stuff in a virtual space. And this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to preach in a virtual space, so I'm excited to see how it goes. So the scripture verse that I picked for today is out of 1 Corinthians 12. I'm going to read just a little bit of it, starting in verse 12, and then hop over to verse 21. So this is 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. And then jumping over to verse 21, still in chapter 12. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, and that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. I'll just set this aside on that pew. And yeah, so University Presbyterian Church right now is currently in a sermon series focused on moving past going to church and into being the church. And at least the way that I see it, it's kind of an invitation of being more passive and maybe consuming church, so to speak, and into a more active stance, out of being consumers and into being active ambassadors for the kingdom of God. And I think that's a really important. I'm going to move this up, actually. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. Sorry about that. I think it's a really important invitation for us in this time to move into that active stance of being active ambassadors for the kingdom, to be able to move out into the world in whichever way that we're able to, whether that's conversations virtually or acts of kindness to our neighbors, to be active ambassadors for the kingdom of God and being the church as opposed to going to church. So when I was Ren invited me to preach, she said that I could pick any metaphor for the church and kind of expand on that or flesh that out. And no pun intended on fleshing it out, but I had the opportunity to pick the body, and I chose it. So starting to think about the body, just the idea of bodies, I've always been amazed at how complex and how resilient our bodies are. And I remember as a kid, I was pretty clumsy. I played with a lot of knives. Hopefully that's not a surprise to my parents. But I remember being amazed at how I would cut myself, and it would be bleeding, and there'd be this huge gash in my hand. And, minutes later it would stop bleeding, and days later it would heal up, and without me needing to do anything. My body just knew what to do. And I was always kind of amazed by the magic of our body's ability to heal. And also really interested in the idea that bodies come in all different combinations, that there's only a couple ingredients that you need. Eyes, ears, arms, legs, but maybe not even all of those parts can be distributed in all kinds of different combinations that we recognize very easily and very quickly as a body. And that picture of really diverse bodies that come in all different shapes and sizes and different constellations is a real profound picture of the value that we have at University Presbyterian of unity over uniformity. the idea that we are unified in our allegiance to Jesus, but are really, really diverse and have really different ideas and different understandings of who he is and how he works in the world, and still all know the same person. In a lot of ways, it kind of makes me think of, there's that story of the Tower of Babel, where everybody tried to ascend into heaven to, reach God and maybe become God, and God split them all up into these different parts. And in the church, we become one body. We're kind of reunified into that purpose of not reaching God to become God, but to be more like Jesus, that we might reach the world and make him more known. So, thinking more about bodies, it leads me to thinking about, what about this body that Jesus inhabited? Kind of interesting to think about the idea that Jesus could have picked anybody at any time in the nation of Israel to incarnate into. He could have incarnated into a member of David's house at any point in Israel's political history. It could have incarnated into a body today and had the benefit of a cell phone and a Facebook or a Twitter account to be able to reach so many people. And he chose instead to incarnate into the body of a poor family who would flee into exile as refugees at a point in Israel's history in which they were oppressed and occupied by Rome, one of the most brutal political regimes ever to grace the face of our planet. And if we take seriously the idea that Jesus is the perfect image of God and the most complete revelation of God, that's got to tell us something about God's character, that he would choose to inhabit the body of a very poor family in the middle of very intense political oppression and economic oppression. And when we choose, or we make the choice for Jesus, we make the choice to be able to, we move towards Jesus because he moves towards us. And when we find ourselves pledging our allegiance to Jesus, it's a really wonderful thing in a lot of ways and a really terrible thing in a lot of other ways. The wonderful part to me is that it ushers us into a community that transcends time and space. And that might sound a little weird and a little kind of spacey in some ways. But think about the idea that we are part of a community that spans the entire globe and stretches far, far into the past and will reach far, far into the future. And that we're part of a body that has a common purpose of being able to make the world a more equitable and just place to live. Not because that's an ideal of ours per se, but because that is the character of Jesus. And when we find ourselves in allegiance to Jesus, it's a really strange thing in the fact that we find a new home in the body of Jesus and in relationship to Jesus, and that same home that we find in Jesus is going to disconnect us or kind of dislocate us from these other ways that a lot of other people will construct their identities. The metaphor of a body is really interesting to me because this is an idea that I've had kicking around in my brain for a little while, but the idea that my eyeball and my pancreas have more in common than my eyeball has with somebody else's ear or their nose or even their eyeball. That they might, even though they might perform the same function, they're not part of the same body. They're not pursuing the same goals, and they're not trying to achieve the same ends. And even though they perform very similar functions, they're really different in a lot of ways. Even though they might look the same and act the same. And when we are part of Christ's body, we can end up in a similar place. We might end up with people who agree with us politically or share a vocation or just kind of look like us, and still at the same time be so different in what we're pursuing and what we value because of our allegiance to Jesus. And that can be a little confusing, that can be a little disorienting, and it can cause a lot of tension. And one of the other things that comes to mind for me when I'm thinking about the idea of the body and our allegiance to Jesus in that is that bodies, the way that we, the way that we tell the difference between my body and other people's bodies, like I said, is like what kind of spirit inhabits it. And when we are part of a body that is motivated and energized by Jesus, we want to be more like him. We want to serve the ideas that and the practices that he represents and represented or is passed down to us through the Gospels. And like we talked about, he chose to incarnate in a certain place at a certain time, and he also, and this is a complicated idea that I don't feel like I've quite got my own arms around, but I wanted to try to put it into words here, which is that, and Paul, I feel like Paul kind of gets at that, tries to get at this idea in that passage that I read a little bit earlier in 1 Corinthians 12. That the idea that the body is made up of lots of different parts, some that are more honorable, some that are less honorable, and or for whatever that word might mean. And like the parts that are considered broadly less honorable are the parts that we protect the most. And in Jesus' ministry, it seems important to me that he brought dignity and value to people in all different places in the social strata and the economic strata without necessarily changing their status. He conveyed a sense of value and belonging and dignity to people without necessarily changing where they were in the world or what their place in society was. And that, to me, is part of trying to be able to expand the kingdom. Not that we don't want to be able to eliminate poverty and racism and militarism, but that we want to be able to convey to people dignity where they are, exactly how they are in that moment, that they don't need to be different than they are for us to see them as full, whole, wonderful, fascinating, enjoyable human beings. So, kind of following along these same lines as far as the body goes. Another thing that came up for me as I was thinking about the body, and especially being 39, which might not seem that old to everybody that's listening to this, but seems old to me because it's the oldest I've ever been, is that my body just doesn't work the same that it used to. I'll wake up and sleep on my arm weird, and then it'll hurt for 2 weeks, or maybe not quite as sharp as I used to be. There's lots of things that just don't work the way they used to. And in the Gospels, we hear about bodies breaking down all the time. And one of the ways that we hear about bodies not working quite the way that they're supposed to, especially in the Gospels, is people who are experiencing leprosy. And it was about a year ago, actually, I read a book called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. It's a book co-written by a guy named Dr. Paul Brandt and Philip Yancey. Philip Yancey is a journalist and has written lots of great books. Paul Brandt was, I think, or maybe is, a doctor and a medical doctor, and runs a leprosy clinic in Louisiana, and has spent a lot of his career working with leprosy patients, trying to help them recover from that disease. And I didn't know much about leprosy other than it was bad. And Dr. Brandt's book really kind of laid out what happens or what the process of leprosy is. And at least from my kind of layman's understanding of what leprosy is there's a bacteria that takes up residence in the nervous system and a lot of peripheral nerves. And what it does is it disrupts the connection between different parts of the body and the central nervous system, or the source. And what happens with that is these different parts of our body are no longer able to provide feedback or either provide feedback to the source or get feedback from the source. And what happens in that is that they start to deteriorate. Dr. Brandt talked about a lot of times when that happens in optical nerves, the kind of unconscious drive to blink goes away, and people stop blinking, and that causes a lot of problems with their eyes, or they'll get cuts on their hands that they don't notice. Other parts of their body. And one of the other things that he mentioned was that people, especially if they're walking a lot, we don't realize how much unconsciously we shift weight on our bodies when we're getting feedback from those different parts, and those parts are able to get feedback from the source. And that these, a lot of times people will end up kind of crushing their own feet because they're not redistributing weight as they move. And this idea of leprosy, and its relationship to the body, especially the church right now, seems like there is some stuff there for us to explore. In the idea that we can become disconnected from the source and disconnected from pain that is in our body. So Dr. Brandt, in that book, because he spent almost his whole career working with leprosy patients, talks about this, an instance in his life in which he had come back from a conference, got really sick, and then as a part of that, lost sensation in one of his feet. And one of his greatest fears was contracting leprosy, because it's, especially at the time, was very difficult to treat. And so he fell asleep and woke up out of a long kind of fever-induced sleep. And he talks about taking a straight pin that he had with him, and he had lost some sensation in the bottom of one of his, I think his left foot. And he talks about sticking that pin into his foot and being so relieved to feel pain in it when he woke up that after that fever had broke. Because it meant that he could feel what was going on, and that his foot was still connected, and that it wasn't actually leprosy after all. It was just some manifestation of the fever that he had that was caused by something else. And for us as a church, that brings to mind for me two questions. One is, how connected are we to the pain in our body as a church? And how oriented are we to Jesus? Which is to say, how connected are we to the person of Jesus? How in line are we with him? And where has that been disrupted? Either our disruption in our ability to feel, or our capacity to feel the pain in our body as a church, or our capacity to be able to be connected and serving a common purpose with Jesus. And I know that there has been a lot of pain over certainly the past year, and for the history of the church. And when we carry around our own pain and the pain of other people, it can get overwhelming. And I appreciate that, and I don't know what to say about that other than that it's hard, and I do get that. One of the things that I think is important for us to realize, though, is that when we are experiencing pain, it means that we are present and we are connected. And there's so much pain in the history of our church, in the relationship between different races and economic strata. There is currently a ton of pain in our church about current political ideas. One of the kind of clearest indications of pain is anger and irritability, and we can see that in spades right now. And our ability to be aware of it, to be compassionate towards it, to be willing to push into it and experience and tolerate that pain, not as a sign of something terrible, but as a sign that we are connected and that we're aware, and trying to push into it the way that Jesus was present to the pain that he experienced in his own body, has the potential and opens the potential for healing. And one of the things for me that is really important for us to bear in mind with that is that it's really easy for us to become dislocated from Jesus, become disoriented from Jesus, and end up pursuing goals that might look like or sound like things that he would be interested in, but aren't motivated by his Spirit. And we can notice and realize that when we find ourselves either trying to make people different than they are because we want them to be that way, or make people more like us because we're more comfortable when they are that way. And the Spirit of Jesus is not about trying to change people to make them more like us. It's about being able to liberate people to be more like who they really are. And when Jesus talks about, throughout the Gospels and the rest of the epistle writers talk about dying to ourselves or being crucified, to me, what that looks like isn't trying to get rid of who we are or to become less of who we are or lose ourselves in something, but to be more of the piece of the body that we are, to make sure that, to make sure that the functions, the gifts and skills that we have innately in us are put in service of Jesus and not kind of walled off or don't turn into a competing little kingdom that we're trying to set up for ourselves. And it's really, really, really easy to end up in that space. So these two ideas of being present and willing to connect to the pain of our church body on both sides, and being able to stay oriented and rooted only and exclusively in Jesus and let everything else flow out of that are the two things that feel like they kind of come out of this idea of leprosy, that the idea that we can easily become disconnected from the pain or disconnected from Jesus and end up in places and spaces that we never intended really easily is something for us to be mindful of as a body. So again, some of these ideas are ones that I don't feel like I got all figured out for myself, and I appreciate you holding them in your own minds and in your own hearts, and working to show up to be a body and that is active in the world and working to change what do I want to say? How do I want to say that? Working to be able to change the normal ways of relating to each other, to be able to see the dignity that each person has just as they are, and to be able to hold on to the dignity of who we are without having to hide or change or tone down who we are to try to fit somebody else's expectations.
Fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high, every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. You say I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I think I am weak. You say I am held when I am falling short, when I don't belong. Oh, you say I am yours. at your feet.